This is file item number 9. File item number 9. You issued another one of your reports, no pun intended, that's roiling the waters, huh?
I did indeed, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, my name is Craig Wilson, the Delta Water Master. Before I begin my formal remarks, I too would like to congratulate Joe on his retirement. I feel that Joe is the epitome of a hardworking public servant, and I think he will be missed. I also want to congratulate Mr. Knopp on your appointment. I think you have the tools to succeed in this job. You have a good board. You have a hardworking staff. It's just the chair I'm not so sure about.
Me too.
Actually, I want to extend some congratulations to the chair. I don't know if a lot of you read the Capital Weekly, the political magazine that comes out, and Mr. Eisenberg was again designated as one of the leading political figures in the state, which is a pretty good deal. And interestingly enough, in the listing of that, Mr. Eisenberg was called Sacramento's Renaissance Man. That's almost as cool a title as the Delta Water Master.
If I did not know exactly how that list was prepared, I might be more impressed than I am. But they have managed to solicit the opinion of aging former Capitol reporters and know-it-alls, and those are the only people who I know and know me, and so they're at least 20 years out of date.
Okay, on to the formal remarks. I actually have two presentations for the price of one. One short presentation on a report that I'm submitting to the Council today on the topic of statutory water rights enforcement authority, and then secondly, a very brief update on some of the day-to-day activities of the Water Master Office, particularly on the topic of informational gathering of water use in the Delta. So the first report is dealing with water rights enforcement. So if I could get the PowerPoint up on that, perfect. If I could go back a bit in history, back in 1970, no less of authority than Justice Ronald Roby called the newly created Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act the toughest enforcement statute in the nation regarding environmental matters. And since 1970, as many of you have known, Justice Roby served as a member of the State Water Resources Control Board. He was director of the Department of Water Resources, and now he's on the 3rd District Court of Appeal, where he's authored several seminal water decisions. And since 1970, the Porter-Cologne Act has been amended several times to augment its already powerful enforcement authorities, to include administrative civil liability authority, authority to inspect facilities, authority to require technical and monitoring reports, and streamline processes. As such, I think Porter-Cologne Act in the water quality field, if it's not retained its status as the toughest water quality statute in the nation, is probably very close. The state's Water Rights Authority, not so much. By almost every measure, the Water Rights Authority is lacking when compared to the enforcement authorities in the Porter-Cologne Act. Now, some would argue that there's some differences in the landscape that account for this, that you're mixing up apples and oranges, that the Porter-Cologne Act deals with discharges of waste to a water body, whereas the Water Right Program is talking about diverting water from water body. But I say that's really not that much of a difference. I think both programs fundamentally are there to protect the beneficial uses of water, to make sure water is used properly, that it's not over-allocated, and is used within the constitutional precepts of reasonable use and beneficial use. So I think the program should be similar, and they're not. They're not even close. When comparing the Water Rights Authority to the Water Quality Authority, the deficiencies of the water rights enforcement authorities are fairly glaring. The Administrative Civil Liability Authority, it's weaker. The ability to inspect facilities is weaker. The ability to require diverters to prepare technical and monitoring reports, it's non-existent. Service of process, more difficult. The process itself, more cumbersome. Some examples that I've dealt with in connection with my job, We have a lot of paperwork requirements. People have to file reports, and the law is very convoluted and cumbersome on how you can possibly get to an enforcement action when a person just absolutely fails to file a report. Whereas in the water quality side, that can be done very easily. You have to have kind of a cumbersome two-step process where you issue what's called a cease and desist order for failing just to file a paperwork report, and if it's still not filed, you have to go through a kind of a separate but very similar process to assess penalties. Waste and unreasonable use proceedings are even more convoluted. You have to basically go through 3 steps before you could get to a direct enforcement action. You have to have a finding, a violation, again go through the cease and desist authority, and then finally to the direct process of assessing penalties. Service of process is also very curious in the water rights field. Basically, service of process has to be done by certified mail or by personal service. So if people can evade service, you kind of deaden the water until you can effectuate service. In the water quality area, constructive service is allowed through presumptions that...
Constructive services are where someone's ducking you successfully. You're entitled to make a showing and get a court recognition that service has been actually made.
Precisely.
But although it's not easy to get, it can be gotten. But you don't have that ability in the water rights side.
Correct. Whereas in the Water Quality Authority, it's there. There's references to the California Code of Civil Procedure that are not in the water rights side of the shop. Now, many of these deficiencies have been pointed out by others in the past. I'll call out one body that did recognize it very clearly in the Delta Vision program in its report. Recognized some of these deficiencies and recommended improvements. And in fact, when the 2009 water reform legislation was making its way through the legislative process, there were attempts made to strengthen the water rights enforcement authorities. And a couple of additions were made. One of them was in the Statements of Water Diversion and Use program, where the law says very clearly that you can go directly to an enforcement action for a failure to provide a statement of water diversion and use. But that just points out the anomaly where you can go to a direct enforcement activity over those types of statements. You can't for a failure of a permittee or a licensee to file one of their required reports. Another thing that 2009 reform legislation did was to augment the water rights staff, but without effective tools, that staff will be somewhat hampered in their job.
And of course, the funding for that was supposed to be part of the fee authority of the board, but that got reversed at a later time, and the funding expansion is now subject to all the claims against the general fund, is my recollection.
It's kind of a combination. It's sort of in doubt, so there's some issues there too. So the report that I submitted to you today does have some specific recommendations as to what to do. I could have recommended an even broader approach, but some of the ideas I presented I think are feasible and appropriate, and they deal with the issues that I've talked about before: service of process, the ability to investigate alleged water right issues, authority to require monitoring reports, and broader administrative civil liability authority. And I think there are other ideas that could have been considered and I did not put in this report, such as higher penalties and some administrative streamlining, interim relief, and statutory adjudication processes. But I just thought that this was a core of ideas that could be examined by others. And so I hope that both the Water Board, your body, and others look at these recommendations. To me, the question is not whether to enhance the Water Rights Authority, but how to best go about doing it, whether you have a very comprehensive approach or you break it down into pure direct enforcement proposals and administrative streamlining proposals and informational gathering proposals. Those are all kind of judgment calls, but I think what shouldn't be a judgment call is to make a serious effort to try to reform these statutes to make them consistent with the water quality side of our programs.
Well, on this, let's ask our legal staff, Mr. Stevens, who's in the back of the room, and our policy staff, Mr. Knopp, to take a look at these ideas, see, match them up against the Delta plan and our statutory requirements, and within a reasonable time, get back to us with your observations, comments, and recommendations. Have you presented this already to the Water Board? I must confess I don't remember that.
Yes, I submitted the report to the Water Board last week.
Okay, all right. And they have also, let's see, they haven't yet adopted their legislative program for 2013, I don't believe.
No, all I've done is made recommendations. But as
Okay.
you know, Mr. Chairman, the agencies typically, when the legislature's in recess, they're putting together proposals. They have to be submitted up through Cal EPA and the governor's office before they can be made formal.
Okay, good.
So now I'll go on.
What's the surprise double bill? I'm
I'm
sorry, Randy.
Craig, a couple of questions on this. One, there's either a violation that occurs by somebody taking more water than they are authorized to take, or they are taking water and applying it someplace that they're not authorized to apply it, place of use. In your experience thus far, which of those two is the one that you're most concerned about? Both? Neither?
I'd say of the two, probably applying excessive amounts of water, or actually even appropriating water, without going to the board for formal authority to do that. I think we've had some investigations. It's not in the legal delta, but up in the North Coast where it's been covered. There's a lot of fairly small, but there's cumulatively a fairly amount of water that's being appropriated into storage facilities without any application being made to the board to do that.
And is your particular area of concern related to individual landowners as opposed to water agencies?
Well, I think there's a mix of both. Some of the major water agencies have very large water rights, and as I get into my next proposal, my next presentation, I'll talk about some enforcement actions related to the big guys. I mean, a lot of my efforts in the Delta are talking about fairly small diverters of water, but cumulatively, somewhat significant. But we have to look at both the big guys and the little guys.
Okay.
So we're going to go on to the second, which is just kind of a brief update on some of the day-to-day activities of the Office of Delta Water Master. And it kind of goes back to the theme I presented to the council before, that one of the things I think we really need to spend a lot of time on is the issue of certainty, trying to get more certainty of water use in the Delta, the number of diversions, the amount of diversions being made, and the validity of the water right claims themselves. And so we're using a mix of things to try to get that certainty, including informational gathering and some compliance and enforcement activities. And enforcement and informational gathering, I think it's important. I think it's a direct quote out of your Delta plan that informed decision-making requires information. So the more information we have regarding use of water in the Delta, the better and more informed our decision-making can be. And the main tool we're using to try to get that information is this expanded and more robust statement of water use and diversion, and I'll present some statistics on that. We're also looking at district outreach, making the statement forms more clear and getting into this issue that will be triggered next year regarding more robust water measurement requirements, both statewide and in the Delta. So this is, I think I presented to you this small chart before, but it just shows kind of the more...
This is what you've done on that unique study within the Delta,
Yes.
RIN Delta water use. Yeah.
Yes, and it just kind of shows the total number of diverters, and that the main point of the chart is to see that most of the people diverting water in the Delta are not doing so pursuant to board-issued permits or licenses, but pursuant to other water rights, such as what are called pre-1914 water rights and riparian water rights. Now, this chart kind of shows the effort that we've made to try to get the information before us, because in order to make these informed decisions, we have to get the reports that are being asked for. And if you contrast what this shows for the reports that for the year 2011 with what happened in 2009, I think your Delta plan, when it talks about some of the deficiencies of information gathering, shows that in 2009 the board only got about 60% of the reports that they'd asked for. And you can see from this report, I think this is even a little out of date, I think we're over 93% now in our effort to gain reports. Now, next year is going to be a real challenge because next year is when the big slug of reports come in from Delta users based on their requirement to triannually report on their statements of water diversion and use, whereas we're dealing with 300 and something people for this year. Next year, we're going to be talking over 2,000 people. So that kind of harkens back to some of these enhancements to the Water Right Enforcement Authority I was talking about. A lot of these great statistics here are by basically having one or two people on my staff calling and cajoling and convincing people they ought to file these reports. And with talking about 2,000 or so next year, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to do that as well. And turning a little bit to some of the enforcement efforts, we've had a couple of settlement decisions where penalties were issued. We've had several cease and desist orders issued, mainly for paperwork violations, and most of them have resulted in compliance, which is the name of the game. Going back to Randy's questions about the big guys versus the little guys, I have spent a fair amount of time actually looking at the major projects and some of their requirements to make flow releases. I issued something called a notice of violation to the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation last month regarding some pulse flow issues and releases.
Were they happy to receive it?
Not particularly. I guess that goes into the category of no good deed goes unpunished, because I heard some grief from the Bureau regarding, why did you do this? And I also heard from other people saying, why didn't you take a more formal enforcement action?
You mean a cease and desist order?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And I think I took kind of a measured approach based on the challenges that the Bureau did have and does have in meeting some of those standards and issuing kind of this middle ground idea of a notice of violation. And some of the other issues we were dealing with, dealing with the project operations. I don't know if you recall the Delta Cross Channel got stuck, and it was actually stuck open just right at the time period it was going to be closed for protection of migratory fish. And we worked with the Bureau, and they were able to, in the department, they were able to manually get the gate shut, and were able to effectuate the repairs while it was shut, so it actually complied with the requirements of the water right permits that it be shut during that period of time. Also spent a lot of time dealing with southern Delta issues, dealing with salinity, which is a continuing and pretty vexing problem. Actually, Whitney was out in the field several times seeing some of the tweaks we could make to the system and how some of the agricultural barriers were operated and the height of those barriers and when the floodgates would be opened and closed. And I think it had some incremental benefit, but there's still issues with that standard, and the board is looking at the entire standard next year, and there may be revisions made to it. So that's just kind of a snapshot of where we're at. I think that the goal is as this information is coming in, we're getting a clear picture of water use in the Delta. Next year is going to be a really big year because we're going to get these monthly reports of actual measurements of water use for the first time, both statewide and in the Delta, and I think that'll really, really help us in our efforts to get more certainty. So with that, I'll close.
And when you were appointed 2 years ago, you had a full head of hair. It was all colored dark. And just 2.5 years in this job has done that to you?
I hate to say it, it's tough.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wilson.